On this week's show, a wild week for Georgia Southern, coming off their loss to Auburn. Thought they had a home game with New Hampshire. Now that game will be played in Birmingham, Alabama, but we will preview the New Hampshire game for you and have much more as we welcome you inside the Eagle's Nest. Welcome inside the Eagle's Nest. I'm your host, Josh Aubrey, being joined by Mike Anthony, sports editor and Georgia Southern beat writer for the Statesboro Herald. And Mike, just like the players and coaches, we're wanting to hurry up and put this past Saturday's debacle behind us and move on to this week's matchup with New Hampshire. But before we can do that, we do have to kind of touch on what happened at Auburn. I don't think either one of us really knew what to expect from the offense, because when we watched the scrimmages, you had guys in there that we probably figured were not going to necessarily be in there. You had a defense who kind of knew what the offense was doing, and you're just not going to show everything in the scrimmages that you're going to show in the games. What we did see, it looked a little bit to me offensively more like what Doug Ruse and Willie Fritz ran as far as an offense goes, as opposed to what Georgia Tech runs. And I knew that they had talked about going under center. It does not look like that is the plan for this year, at least from what Bryan Cook said in his press conference. Your thoughts on offensively what Georgia Southern did and what you expect this season?
Yeah, it's really tough for Georgia Southern. I think that everybody expected more. Certainly no one expected Georgia Southern to pull the upset, except there's always going to be a few people who are saying anything can happen, and the downside of that is that anything can happen in both directions, and really it was a nightmare for Georgia Southern. Their first 6 drives going 3 and out, really not even having positive total yardage until midway through the second quarter. And it's tough to tell if this is just a matter of execution, if it's a matter of just not being good enough, if it's a matter of Auburn being as good as their ranking would indicate they are. I think that talking to the coaches, you kind of got some answers coming from all of those sides. I know offensive coordinator Bryan Cook said that it wasn't necessarily the guys are going in the wrong direction, but they either weren't getting to the guy or they weren't executing their block when they did get there. Maybe that speaks to the talent of Auburn. Maybe we have to wait and see until Georgia Southern can play some defensive linemen, maybe a little closer to their level. But overall, it's just very disheartening. It's hard to tell how much to take out of it. You got to see how Auburn can do against a good Clemson team. If they do the same thing to them, if they look like a strong national title contender, maybe you start to feel a little bit better, especially if Georgia Southern can bounce back and have that offense look better this week.
I must say that if you look back and you study a little history, you will see that primarily Georgia Southern has struggled when they open the season against an FBS school, especially a ranked FBS school. You can go back to the Miami games. You can look at the Florida game. You can look at the West Virginia game from just a few years ago.
Georgia.
NC State was probably one of the only ones that I think did not hold form, but for the most part, FBS schools for the first game of the season have not worked out well. It's been the mid-year 2 or 3, 5, 7 game of the season where they've had a little bit more success. So don't go, I guess the thing is to not panic yet. If they struggle again against New Hampshire, though, I don't know. Speaking of which, New Hampshire is coming in. They're a top 15 ranked FCS school. Before we get into New Hampshire, I will bring this up as I did in the press conference. How much difference do you think there is between a top 10, 15 ranked FCS school and, say, the Sun Belt?
Well, I think that after so many years of Georgia Southern being an FCS power, you would have the Georgia Southern fans who would go into Athens, they go into Auburn, to Alabama, and they'll say that, hey, we can really line up with you. It's all about that depth. You've got the 22 extra scholarships at the FBS level. After that, things really tend to drop off. And for so many years, that's what you would see out of Georgia Southern teams. In the first and second quarter, maybe the talent level's a little different, but they can definitely hang in there, and they could certainly do it if they ever played teams that were a little bit lower down in, say, the Sun Belt or Conference USA level. And I really don't think it's even speculative. In 2014, Georgia Southern's roster, it was a majority FCS players, FCS recruits, and you saw what they did to the Sun Belt. 8-0, would have gone to a bowl if they had been eligible. So I don't think there's any doubt that the top teams and the top players on the top teams in the FCS can hold their own against almost anybody, but certainly a Sun Belt caliber team. I think it's a matter of, does that heat wear on them? Do some injuries pop up? What happens when Georgia Southern is able to rely on a scholarship player as a second or third stringer, whereas New Hampshire, if a guy goes down, you might not even have a scholarship guy to back him up.
All right, well, that brings us to the game coming up here. It's not on the books in Vegas. I would think it would be somewhere between a 10 and maybe 16, 17 point. Georgia Southern being the favorite. New Hampshire runs the ball well. Their quarterback was their leading rusher this past week. They've got another running back who's pretty well. It's going to be more on the ground than through the air. Does that benefit Georgia Southern? I think that their DBs are pretty strong against the pass, and the defensive line was a bit of a question mark, but they seem to do okay against Auburn.
Yeah, you touched on the defensive line, and if you're going to pull any positive out of the Auburn game, I think you've got to go with that defensive line. That was my biggest concern, because not only do you have a strong running game in Auburn, a strong veteran offensive line, you had a defensive line for Georgia Southern that was as young as it's ever been, and probably as small as it's ever been, at least since the FCS days. I was really worried that Georgia Southern was going to have to send 8 and 9 guys crashing in to mitigate the running game. That wasn't the case for much of the night. They also got 3 sacks. They forced the fumble that led to the only points of the game. So if they can play like that on that level throughout the season, not that New Hampshire's a pushover, but that's not the Auburn offensive line they'll have to contend with.
All right, well, we've got plenty to bring you from interviews. We had a chance to talk with offensive coordinator Bryan Cook, who kind of addressed how things are going on the offensive side of the ball. And we have Tyson Summers talking a little bit more about New Hampshire and what he expects, and the players reflecting both on the Auburn loss and the upcoming home opener with New Hampshire.
Try to develop an offense so that you can have answers for what you're going to see, so that you get experience doing what you're going to need to do this year to be successful. And the flip side of that coin is you don't want to give him too much. You want to put him in a position where he can succeed. And not just him. There were a lot of guys out there that had never been at that spot in that type of moment before, let alone in a home game against a lesser opponent. So it was all new to a lot of guys, not just the quarterback. We had a bunch of guys that got out there under the lights, and they might have gone near the right guy. They didn't take the right steps. They didn't execute the right technique. They didn't do all the details that when you get in an environment like that for the first time, you get a little bit wide-eyed, and the level of execution went by the wayside.
I think a lot of people expected Georgia Tech's scheme offensively when you came here. Is this more what we're going to see, or are there more things like Georgia Tech ran that we will see in the future?
That's a good question. You've got to, obviously, that offense has had tremendous success, okay? I love that offense, and what we tried to do was take what was in the locker room and see what they did best, make a decision based on how we were going to win week 1, week 2 with what we had in the locker room, and then take a lot of those concepts from that offense and try to marry into what we have in the locker room. Up front, this offensive line has been built for zone scheme. When we got here, they were bigger bodies. There are things under center where you need, tackles that are basically like tight ends, just releasing down the field and can really move. We had bigger body zone blockers in the offense, and we felt like to give us the best chance to win, those guys probably need to stay in a zone world. And from the gun, that's really the world that you live in. And under center it's very time consuming. It's not something that you can just do a couple of times a game. I think you've got to that's got to be who you are. And our biggest task this offseason we wanted to have an identity. We still do. We've got to be good at something. And there's even, when we talk about practicing this week, there's only so much time in a day. And how you spend it is probably the biggest decision that we have to make as a staff. And our goal is to get good at running the gun option. And there are trade-offs. As you compare it to being under center in Georgia Tech's offense, there's, it's not the same. You try to marry the concepts, but it's different.
I don't think by any stretch of the imagination that our offense is going to be predictable. I mean, one of the big pieces I think with Brian and the offensive staff that we're able to bring in here is to be able to bring in some different looks and some different views to things. We're certainly going to have to continue to look and expand kind of not only our playbook, but different looks that we have from a formation standpoint or a motion standpoint to be able to give us a chance to be successful here in the future. Again, I think that we all knew. It was the same questions y'all asked last Monday about Shai coming in, the first-time starter. I think Shai really handled himself well from a leadership role. Do we have to do a better job of making some decisions? Sure we do. And those are things that we, anticipated. And as we go into this next game, we certainly think that he's going to grow from this and be able to learn from it. And I think it's going to be a really positive thing for us as we move forward.
Coach, how do you prevent internally and externally the here we go again mentality after seeing the offense and what happened on Saturday?
Well, internally, I think we started that, like I said, back in January. We really wanted to try to make sure, again, in our offseason with our football team, that we took a very holistic view and how we tried to make sure that we were building the culture of our football program and our football team. Externally, I don't know how much I can really control that. Externally, I think that I can certainly try to do the best I can to communicate and be honest and upfront and point out my mistakes and errors and try to be as transparent as I can be with you guys and with the media and kind of let y'all be the voice from there. But I don't know how much I can control of it.
This really some of the stuff I already had seen during the game. Felt like I could have made some better reads early to give us a chance to get some bigger plays. But, it's behind us now. And it's time to move on to this week. We still got a lot of energy. You know what I'm saying? We can't let this one game define our season. You know what I'm saying? True enough, it hurts to lose, but it won't define our season. We're gonna come out here this week in Paulson and we're gonna play.
We're ready to work. I mean, I know these guys have a bad taste in our mouths from the last game, and we just want to go out here and we want to make Eagle Nation proud, and we want to go out here with a win. Hungry. That's the mood of the team. We got a bad taste in our mouth right now, and we want to go out there and fix that out there on Saturday.
Sean McDonald, guys won 2 Eddie Robinson Awards. National Head Coach of the Year, has won the AFCA National Head Coach of the Year. I think he's been there 26 total seasons and 19 straight as a head coach. And I mean, that's what we all hope to be able to accomplish what he's been able to do. They've been in the FCS playoffs 13 straight seasons, which is an outstanding number. I read a statistic last week, where I think it was 11 straight years they were in the top 25, in the AP top 25, which is an outstanding number. Obviously, they won a big rivalry game with Maine last Thursday, and they've got a good football team. Offensively, I think that they're bringing 5 to 6 starters back. A quarterback that's played a bunch of ball for them, a really good slot receiver, very multiple in what they do, very problematic in the things that they create on offense. Because of their ability, really the quarterback's ability to both run and throw and have some talented receivers. Very tough up front with their offensive line and very fundamental in everything they do from a defensive standpoint. I think, I think they've got 7 or 8 of their returning starters. I know, and they base out of a 4-2-5 defense, and I think 5 of their 6 D linemen and linebackers are all returning, and they've got 2 preseason all-conference guys in the secondary. So they're going to be a good football team. I think they're ranked 12th in the country right now, and they played last Thursday, so they'll have a couple extra days of preparation. It's an important week for us to prepare, not only for New Hampshire, but an important week for us to continue to get better and focus on us as well.
Coach, how much of a difference do you think there is in the top 10 or 12, 15 FCS teams and, say, the Sun Belt Conference?
Yeah, I don't know. I think obviously if you look at what history tells you and a really good Georgia Southern program, obviously being able to come up, and we come up and go right in, have an opportunity to win the Sun Belt. I think you see the immediate success of the team in the mountains up in North Carolina and their success that they've been able to have in their transition from FCS. I think that you see a lot of those teams that can. I know from a recruiting standpoint, there's very little difference between a guy that's one of the top tier guys at a FCS program and somebody that we're recruiting. I mean, ultimately we wind up really kind of recruiting all of the best players. There may be the difference in an inch or two here, or 15 or 20 pounds, or does he run a 4.72 instead of a 4.61? All things that us coaches, somehow miss the point on sometimes. And so I think that there's a lot of comparisons there. I really do. And obviously, this head coach is a guy that's been here before and has been to Paulson Stadium, and certainly he's a guy that is chosen to be there for a long time and has had a lot of success through his career. So I think when you start talking about really good FCS programs like the one that New Hampshire has and continues to have, and the sustainability that they've had is really hard to do anywhere. And obviously having the same head coach there for a long time gives them that ability. But they are a very impressive football team, and we're going to have to become ready to play.
All right, Mike, this is usually a time we kind of predict the scores, kind of give our assessment, what we feel is going to happen. I thought last week was going to be 42-17. We get the field goal. Maybe I'm a little closer, but they did miss a couple too, so I don't know. Your prediction last week was a little less points for Auburn, a little more points for Georgia Southern. This week they got New Hampshire. Your thoughts on what you think the score might be?
Well, I think that the line that you kind of made up there of 10,
To
14, 17 even, I think that that's pretty close. Georgia Southern, I think on paper, is a better team. You look at last week, and it's really easy to have a bad feeling in your stomach because of the stats. I think that if you try to separate yourself from the stats and the bad running game, 42-7, it looks a little ugly, but that would not have been a score that's laughed at if you threw it out there as a possibility. This is an SEC team ranked number 12 in the country. So overall, I think that Georgia Southern did the best it could given the basically horrible offense. So if they can clean that up, I'm not gonna anticipate explosion from that offense until I see it. I think I'm done projecting that even against an FCS team. But I do think that the defense proved that it can shut down a lesser offense in New Hampshire. If the offense can maybe give the defense a break, keep them off the field for so long, mount a couple of scoring drives, I think that Georgia Southern has what it takes to cover that 2-touchdown spread. I see it somewhere in the realm of 27-10.
All right, I'm going to go a little bit higher for Georgia Southern, say 31, but I think New Hampshire scores 17 in the game. So I'm seeing it in about the same, about a 14-point win for the Eagles. All right, before we go, let's go over some of the other sports that are going on right now. The Georgia Southern men's soccer team hanging with the number 5 ranked team in the nation this past week. I think that kind of caps the best of this past week, even though it was a loss. And then you had the women's soccer team in action as well as volleyball. Give us a quick rundown.
Yeah, the women's soccer team, they had their longest road trip, I'm going to assume ever, going out to Washington State and playing a couple of games. A couple of losses there, but now they get a full week before Sun Belt play starts, so a chance to kind of recoup, look at the tape, see how they want to build that team going into conference play. The men, as you mentioned, another tough loss, a bunch of tough losses this season. It looks like the defense is there. Only a handful of goals allowed in their first 3 or 4 games, and as you said, a top team in the entire country. Number 5 Clemson really being battled. Even just a late goal in overtime, extra time for Clemson, is able to get them the victory there. So I look for big things from them moving forward. You can build a lot of confidence off of that. As for volleyball, another weekend, another tournament, another 1-2 mark. So a little bit of a stumble out of the gate for Georgia Southern volleyball, but as we mentioned last week, they play a lot of these preseason tournaments. It gets them a lot of experience. Hopefully they can see what the right combination of players, the right attack plan will be from these first weeks going into conference play.
All right, well, that'll wrap things up for now. For Mike Anthony, I'm Josh Aubrey. We thank you for joining us. Hope to see you again next week.